Welcome to episode 143 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Mike McGowan, who served with the FBI for more than 30 years. Most of his career was spent in the Philadelphia and Boston divisions. In this episode, Mike reviews his memoir, Ghost, My 30 Years as an FBI Undercover Agent, that recaps his long career working undercover against some of the most dangerous, sophisticated, and notorious criminal organizations and individuals throughout the world. Mike participated in excess of 50 FBI undercover operations, successfully infiltrating Italian LCN and Russian organized crime groups, Mexican drug cartels, outlaw motorcycle gangs, contract murderers, and corrupt public officials, all resulting in significant arrests, seizures, and lengthy incarcerations. He was an instructor at the FBI Undercover Certification School in Quantico, Virginia, and also served as an operational counselor for the FBI's Undercover Safeguard Unit, evaluating undercover FBI personnel for operational and psychological readiness. After retiring from the FBI, Mike started the 7329 Group, a law enforcement undercover training and entertainment consulting firm. His book, Ghost, has been optioned for development as a feature film by Sylvester Stallone's production company. This, of course, is the second time I've interviewed Mike. In episode 136, where he discussed being falsely accused of stealing more than $200 million worth of heroin and cocaine, was so well received that I knew I had to get him back right away. I know you're going to enjoy this interview as much as you did the first one. But before we get to the interview, please give me just a moment to wish those who celebrate Thanksgiving a very, very, very happy Thanksgiving. I, myself, have so much to be thankful for this year. My family's healthy. I'm having such a fun time recording the podcast. My books are doing well. And I can tell you, I'm living and loving my life. And I'm so grateful that as you live your life, you're taking me on the ride with you. As you work out, commute to work, mow the lawn, shovel the snow, I am so happy that you're listening to the show. Thank you so much. There's one thing, though, that you can do for me. I absolutely love producing this show, especially having the opportunity to meet so many other retired agents, former colleagues that I didn't have a chance to meet when I was in the Bureau. But there's so many great cases that I don't know anything about. So if you're a retired agent listening to this show, or you know a retired agent who only has to download a computer file or search in a box in the attic for a great case to review, you know, blowing the dust off of that old PowerPoint presentation. So if you have a case review suggestion for 2019, I would love to hear from you. Just email me, jerrywilliamsauthor@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Don't forget that during November, anyone who joins my reader team or is already a member of my reader team is eligible to win a You Can't Get This Anywhere Else FBI holiday ornament. There's more information about the giveaway and a photo of the ornament in my November reader team email. Stick around after the interview and I'll tell you how you can join my reader team and become eligible for the giveaway. But for now, here's the show. I am absolutely delighted to invite back again to FBI Retired Case File Review, retired agent Mike McGowan. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Jerry. Thank you for having me on again.
Well, I can tell you the first episode where we talked about the first half of your book, Ghost, My 30 Years as an FBI Undercover Agent, was definitely well received. I heard from many listeners who enjoyed the episode and went right out and purchased your book. I also attended our monthly luncheon with the ex-agents chapter here in Philadelphia, the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI. And I can tell you that they also were very excited about the episode and your book. I guess the question I should ask you is, how did the book launch go?
The book launch went very well. Amazon just had it as the #1 release in criminology on their site. So far, so good. Everything's going well.
I've already talked a little bit about the really exciting news about the book. So why don't you go ahead and share that with us?
Yeah, the last time we were on was just prior to the book launch. The book launch was early in October. And about 2 weeks after the book launch, I officially reached an agreement that my film rights have been optioned to Sylvester Stallone's new production company called Balboa Production for a feature film. So as of October of this year, the book is going to hopefully eventually turn into a movie.
That is just so exciting. I mean, like, that is the dream of everyone who writes a book, is that the book is going to be turned into a movie. So congratulations. I'm really excited for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, one of the things that I've done from the very beginning of this podcast, it was one of my mission statements, was that I talk about the cliches and misconceptions about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. As a matter of fact, that's what I'm writing now, a nonfiction book titled FBI and Film and Fiction. I take it there's a script writer who's going through your book now, creating the story, how they're going to want to portray it as a movie.
Yeah, so once we reached an agreement, I went out to Los Angeles for a little bit over a week to sit down with the Balboa group and find out exactly what was planned. And the first step is the development of a screenplay, which is being done as we speak. We're hoping to have it completed by the end of 2018. It's a lot of work. I have to work closely with the assigned writers, and we've just begun that process.
Well, that's interesting, because I know a lot of times when a development company, production company options to have a book, the author is kind of put in the background and doesn't really have a lot to say. They sell the rights to the book and then they're kind of out of it. I remember talking to Joe Pistone and him being very, very clear about the fact that in that movie, Donnie Brasco, that there were a couple of things that he really hated that they made part of the movie. One situation where the character slaps his wife, which Joe makes sure to tell everyone that didn't happen. And then there's another situation where the character has a bag full of cash, giving the impression that he has stolen or skimmed, from the FBI. And Joe makes that very clear that that didn't happen. So how do you know that that's not going to happen? Or are you afraid that that could happen, to the movie that's made from your book, that there are things in it that didn't really happen that make you look bad?
I was very fortunate in this process. So I'm represented by two attorneys. One you may recognize, Tom Suddeth, who used to be an AUSA in Philadelphia.
Oh yeah, I had one of my big cases with him. I love Tom. Yeah, cool.
So Tom is one of my attorneys, and Tom referred me to a second attorney by the name of Michael Sherman out in Los Angeles. He's an entertainment lawyer. He's been in this business for 45 plus years, and the two attorneys have been very protective of my interests. So what we did with the Stallone group, those negotiations took over 6 months. We started in March of this year and concluded it in October. And a couple of things that were included in my contract, which may not be in some other people's contracts, is two things. One is I have what's called creative control. And by creative control, it means when there's a scene shown, when there's a scenario within the movie, I have the authority and the legal control to approve or not approve. So hopefully that will eliminate any of those concerns there. And also they were wise enough to negotiate. I have a specific job title and role in the making of the movie, so I will be involved day to day on set, present when anything major is taking place, the sales pitches, once the lights go on, etc. I was very fortunate, as I said, to have two experienced attorneys making sure that my interests were protected. And hopefully some of those problems that Joe had, hopefully I won't have the same issues.
That's unbelievable. Like I said, I know Tom. And matter of fact, Tom listens to FBI Retired Case File Review. So, hey, Tom, and thanks for looking out for Mike. I guess my next question to you is you've seen movies. I'm sure you saw Donnie Brasco, and you've seen a number of movies about undercover agents. So when you look at those type of movies or read books on the subject, what are the cliches and misconceptions that really irk you?
There's a couple things, and truthfully, I've never been a big watcher of FBI stories, only because that's what you and I did every day of our life. And when I came home from work, I wanted to watch something else or do something else. But when I see undercover agents portrayed, especially FBI or federal level undercover agents, they're almost always off the reservations doing crazy stuff against policy and procedure, and nothing could be further from the truth. When you work undercover operations within the FBI, you have a very strict series of guidelines you have to follow, both legal, procedural, policy-wise. And that's just not, you just don't walk into a room and do whatever you want. There's a very clear objective and practice that we go through so that when we do present a case in court, the evidence will withstand defense scrutiny. So we're very careful how we set up and execute undercover operations. There's a tremendous amount of oversight. There's a tremendous amount of preparation. So to have it viewed as just some crazy guy going off the reservation just isn't accurate.
Well, why don't we get into one of your cases and start talking about that? Again, the first episode that you and I did together, we concentrated on the time when you were a case agent in Philadelphia and were falsely accused of taking over $200 million worth of heroin and cocaine out of the evidence room. Fortunately, the real person responsible was caught and sent to prison. And we talked about this a little bit, that most agents would be so devastated, so angry, so wrecked after being falsely accused that they may have ended up leaving the bureau or sitting behind their desk for the rest of their career, not doing anything, just an empty suit, just a disgruntled employee. But instead of that, you became one of the FBI's most experienced undercover agents, sacrificing your personal life, sacrificing your time with your family in order to work undercover for the FBI. And so my question to you, I asked this before and I'll ask it again, is after all that happened to you, why?
It's fairly simple, and I've had a long time now to figure it out. But when that happened in my career, it was 1994 when I was accused, and I had 7 years in the FBI at that point. So I still had, if I was going to remain in the FBI, I still had at least 13 years or more to do. And a couple factors weighed in back in 94. Number one, I had a family. I had a wife and 3 small children at the time. I didn't have the ability or the luxury to quit a job. I had to work to support my family. And then, as you've read in the book, I had an interesting childhood. I had a father who was, at times he was a saint, and other times he was the devil. But one thing he had instilled in all of us kids, we had 5 in my family, he just, I think I named a chapter after it, rubbed some dirt in it. You're going to get knocked down in life, and it's important that you have to get back up. And I took the accusation of the heroin theft to heart, where the FBI knocked me down, that's for sure. But, I made it a practice that I was going to get back up and fight again. So I used the heroin accusation case as really the driving motivation for what I ended up doing the rest of my career, which was basically working full-time undercover. After that, I wanted to prove to the FBI that they were mistaken when they jumped to a conclusion that I somehow was involved in that vile crime. And it just served, as I said, it served as a motivator. Whenever I did an undercover operation, I wanted it, number one, to be successful. And number two, before it would end, I'd already be looking for my next one. So again, I've had 25 years or so to think it through. And at the time, I had to take care of my family, but I also think it was important to show the FBI that was not a fair assessment of my character, my integrity, etc. And I battled back by trying to make successful cases the rest of my career.
Well, of course, as a retired agent, I'm also a cynic. We're very cynical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to ask the question, how much of your decision to work undercover had to do with also wanting to get back to the Boston area?
Actually, it was a factor, but not a big factor. You and I were both assigned to the Philadelphia division. I loved Philadelphia. It was the best office to this day that I was in. I would have loved to stay in Philadelphia, but I also had to consider my family and my wife and children. We had no relatives in the Philadelphia area. We spent, when my kids were little, we used to take them to the movies on Thanksgiving so that they didn't realize they were missing a major holiday. And, the opportunity presented itself to work a case up in Boston, and it was shortly after all the craziness in Philadelphia. The first case, I went up there to work in 96, 97. That was supposed to last 6 weeks, and it lasted 2 years. So I left Philadelphia at the end of 96, early 97, to go work a 6-week case, which turned into about 22 years later.
Well, why don't we talk about one of those cases? And, I went through the entire book, to look at what case that I'd have you review. And of course, because I love Philadelphia too, I picked the case that had the Philadelphia connections. I'm calling it the Bobby Louisi case. I'm not sure what the official case name was, but it definitely had ties to Philly. That connection between the mob in Philadelphia and in Boston. What's the deal with that?
It was a very unusual alliance. So I left Philadelphia in 96. I went to work a Russian organized crime case for a couple of years. So at the end of 1998, it was actually Christmas Day, we arrested the subjects in the Russian organized crime case. That case had taken 2 years. I was reassigned to the Boston division, and I had kind of lost touch with my friends and coworkers in the Philadelphia division. We arrested on Christmas Day, and within a week, I got a call from a dear friend of mine that you would know, John Terry. John Terry was the supervisor of the organized crime squad in Philadelphia. John and I had been classmates at Quantico, and we had maintained a friendship throughout the years. John called me in early 1999, literally the first week of January, and said that Philadelphia had an outstanding opportunity that would impact the Boston division by having an informant in Philadelphia be able to introduce an undercover in Boston to the Boston LCN. If you know anything about organized crime, the Philadelphia LCN and the Boston LCN probably shouldn't have anything to do with one another. They operate independently. But in this case, there was a relationship between the Boston LCN subject named Bobby Louisi and the Philadelphia boss, Joey Merlino. Louisi had approached Merlino about operating in Boston under the authority of Merlino in Philadelphia. And the only reason he was able to get away or try to do that was the previous regime of the LCN in Boston had pretty much been decimated either through federal prosecutions or through some acts of violence. So there was a little bit of a void up here in the late 90s, and Louisi, through his relationship and friendship with Merlino, decided he would operate in Boston under Merlino's authority, which, again, if you know anything about LCN relations, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what they tried to do, and that's what they actually did.
Was that for protection bases?
Yes. Louisi wanted to have the ability to throw Merlino's name around up here. And again, even though it was an unusual alliance and not in line with what most LCN investigations, what happens in most LCN investigations, both the Philadelphia FBI and the Boston FBI, we were ecstatic because it would give us a shot at two families, not one. So we jumped all over the opportunity to introduce an undercover up in Boston to work against both the Boston LCN and the Philadelphia LCN.
I do want to remind everybody that I did have the opportunity to interview John Terry, and that's episode 90. Can you just real quick give us a little bit of the history of the mob in Boston? I know you said that it had been basically dismantled. Who had been the boss and what happened to him?
Well, in Boston, the mob is smaller in Boston than it is in Philadelphia, and the mob in Boston for many, many years was run by a gentleman named Jerry Angiulo. And Angiulo was investigated by the FBI and prosecuted up here in the late 80s. And then during the early 90s, just before I got up here, there was a number of LCN figures who tried to take over power here. And there was a tremendous amount of violence up here. There were shootings, there were bombings, there was all kinds of violence in order for somebody to take the lead. Luisi himself, who we worked, would have been 1997, 98. Luisi's father, brother, cousin, and another friend, four gentlemen, were shot to death in a 99 restaurant up here in Charlestown, Mass. during this LCN violence. So it was a very dangerous, I'm not sure the right word. It just was basically the wild, wild west up here. And again, when Luisi made his move to establish himself as the boss, the FBI wanted to be out in front of it. And through the Philadelphia office with John Terry's squad, we were able to take advantage of that relationship and introduce an undercover into both groups in early 99.
And I take it that's the role that you served.
I was the undercover, correct.
All right. Why don't you set up the case for us? What was going on and what were you trying to gain from this undercover operation?
So when John Terry called me in early 99, he made it so they had the informant down there who's been publicly identified. It's Ron Prevetti. Prevetti passed away this last August. God rest his soul. He's one of the top two informants I ever worked with. So Terry and his squad had a plan that Prevetti would introduce me to the Boston side up here as somebody who had worked with him in Philadelphia and had moved up to Boston because we told him I had been divorced and my children had moved up here, so I wanted to follow my children from Philadelphia to Boston. So in early 99, the Philadelphia office brought Prevetti up here to Boston, and I sat down with Prevetti for probably a week or 10 days, and we put together a plan as to how we knew one another, what we had done in the past, and how we were going to attack the Boston LCN, because Luisi at this point was in weekly communication with Merlino and his crowd. And we also knew from previous Boston investigations that Luisi was involved and had been involved in cocaine trafficking. So we had an opportunity to pursue some serious federal charges against the Boston mob. The irony was that when I was assigned to the Philadelphia division, I was on an arrest team many years earlier in my career. I was on an arrest team that we had arrested Joey Merlino in Philadelphia. I wasn't the case agent. I had no role in that case other than to go out on arrest day, but that led us to realize that I probably couldn't meet directly with Merlino, so I had to stay up in Boston and avoid any interaction with Merlino and rely on Prevetti to gather the evidence in Philadelphia. So my job was to target the Boston LCN subjects, and Prevetti would remain working the Philadelphia aspect of the case. And the other thing John Terry told me the first time he called was there was a statute of limitations issue on the Merlino case, and we had 6 months to accomplish a goal. Sometimes FBI undercover operations can last years, but in this case, John was very clear from the get-go that we had 6 months to make a case up here. So, the pressure was on. We had to gather evidence in a timely fashion if we were going to prosecute, because Philadelphia already had a a time frame in their mind when they were going to execute their arrest warrants and their indictments. So going in January of 99, I knew that by the summer of 99, we had to do whatever we could to make a case up in Boston because the Philadelphia case was going to conclude.
So who were you supposed to be?
I was Michael O'Sullivan. I was a proprietor of a Irish import-export business. I was basically a businessman who colored outside the lines, as we told them. So I was what's known in mob language as an associate. An associate is somebody who makes money on behalf of the mob and kicks up. So we thought that they would be interested in, if I was an earner, somebody who made money for them up in Boston, that would attract the attention of the Boston subjects, which in short order it did.
And so Ron Previty comes up and does he make an introduction?
Yes, he comes up in early January, and we have a meeting the very first day in my office. So I said earlier I had been working a Russian organized crime case. We used the same office that was equipped with audio and video. And Previty, Luisi, and three of Luisi's cronies came to my office that first day. And by the end of the meeting, Luisi said on tape that "you're with us," which in mob talk is very important language. It basically means you can operate under their authority. So within the first 2 hours of meeting Luisi, thanks to Previty's introduction, I was basically assigned to the Boston mob that day and for the next 6 months.
Talk to us about how important it is to have an introduction. Could you have been able to do this on your own?
Absolutely not. What people have to understand, especially in LCN cases, organized crime cases, most of these subjects know one another for years and years and years, if not going back to childhood. So when an undercover is introduced, he's usually the new kid on the block, which makes it a very difficult group to penetrate. Where we try to take advantage of relationships is if we do have an insider, which in this case was Previty. By Previty introducing me, we advanced the investigation probably 6 months to a year that first day, because in their mind, if they trusted Previty, then they could trust me because supposedly I had been working with him for years. So having an insider introduce you into the mob is ideal. Otherwise, no matter what anybody else tells you, it can't be done. They're not going to talk to a complete stranger and you're not going to walk in cold with them. So by having Previty introduce me, we were able to take advantage of that relationship in Philadelphia and able to make a case within that 6-month time window we had.
Well, the most important thing to them about you is that you be productive. So what type of money were you supposedly kicking up to them?
Again, who I was supposed to be a businessman. So I had a legitimate company, a legitimate business, and I worked near Logan Airport, and they were told that I would occasionally dabble outside the lines when things fell off the back of a truck, which is mob talk for stolen property. So we didn't want to go right into drug trafficking with them. We wanted to do things a little bit slower. So I started dealing in stolen property. You have to remember now, this is 1999. This is almost 20 plus years ago. In 1999, I provided them with stolen furs, stolen cigarettes, stolen film. They just thought I could get my hands on stolen property. All of the property that we gave them was actually property that had been seized in other FBI investigations. So I had an office full of props that I could use to show them I made money through stolen property. And from stolen property, we eventually segued into drug trafficking.
Well, you got to tell us about that, because the normal citizen doesn't know how to segue from stolen property to drugs.
Again, there's a method to this madness. The FBI's undercover technique there is a method to it. So what I would do is I was slowly getting them to trust me in criminal activity, and it was stolen property. It wasn't anything that was significant as far as jail time, etc. But by having this stolen property background, it allowed me to spend hours and hours with these guys and get to know them better, get to gather more evidence, and get them to trust me. So my normal day when I worked this case, they didn't really get out of bed and get moving until early afternoon. So I'd wake up, take my kids to school, drop them off. I'd hit the gym. I'd show up at my office about noontime, and inevitably I'd get a page. We had pagers back then. I'd get a page or a phone call to go into the North End, and then I'd spend the rest of the day with them figuring out how to make some money. And they were attracted to my business side because I was somebody who had access to money. I was somebody who could make them money. They basically thought of me as a quasi-legitimate businessman who produced income and shared it with them. So when I did the stolen cigarettes, I did the stolen fur coats, film, we did stolen Rolexes, I would kick a percentage of that over to the mob, which is SOP for mob guys. And, they began to trust me more and more. We knew that we eventually were going to segue into drug trafficking. We had a lot of predication that Luisi was involved in cocaine trafficking. There were a lot of law enforcement agencies interested in him at the time. The FBI had a case. Other federal agencies had investigations, state and local police. Everybody was after him at the time, but we had the inside track because of Privetti's introduction.
Yeah, there's an interesting part of the book where you talk about one of the other law enforcement agencies that were a little upset that the FBI was targeting him and caused a problem for you a little later in the case.
Yeah, that was not a good day. What happened there, and luckily I didn't know about it till long after the case was over, but when we were going to go up against Luisi in early January, about a week before I was introduced to Luisi, another law enforcement agency approached Luisi at his house and attempted to get him to cooperate with them, as they were aware the FBI was going to take a shot at Luisi. Luisi refused to cooperate with them, and as they were leaving, one of the other law enforcement agents told him to be careful who his new friends were. And you can't take that any other way then. They were upset that the FBI was taking a shot at Luisi and kind of threw out that zinger, which later in the case became a safety issue. And eventually that information was disclosed to us, and the SAC of Boston at the time wanted to shut down the case, and we convinced him to continue on. But it created some serious both physical safety problems and some communication problems for me going forward. It was a bad move on their part.
Well, when you talk about safety considerations, first of all, I have to go back because I'll always get an email when there's an acronym used, and some of the listeners don't know what the acronym means. And so you said SOP, and that's Standard Operating Procedure. So I've taken care of that, so I won't get the emails. Yep. But when you talk about safety considerations, I have to ask you two things, because whenever we think about an undercover operation, we think about the undercover agent, the UCA, flying in from someplace else. You not only live in Boston, it sounds like you might even be going into the office occasionally. But the biggest question I have is that you grew up near Boston. So aren't you afraid that somebody is going to find out who you are?
When you work undercover, it's understood. It's a volunteer assignment in the FBI. I should make that clear right off the bat. No one is forced to work undercover. It was something that I enjoyed doing. I took it as a challenge. And yes, I grew up in this area, and I actually lived not very far from where I was working. But there are ways to address that. There are ways to minimize those risks. And also you have to remember, if I'm supposed to be somebody in the Boston area, previously working with Privetti and now going to work with Luisi, I had to know my way around the city. You can't tell somebody you're from one area and then not know which street you're going, which way streets one way and where the local bar is or where the the Patriots or the Bruins played. So you have to have some local knowledge. Agent safety is always the number one priority in the FBI. We set it up in a way. But at the same time, that's our job. Part of being an FBI agent, if you volunteer, is you can become an undercover agent, and you understand going in that there's going to be some risk taken. Well, that's also true of our SWAT team members. That's true of every special agent that goes to work every day. When they leave the office, anything can happen. That's what happens in law enforcement. In undercover work, you may be putting yourself in harm's way a little more frequently. But as long as you understand it, and as long as you set up the operation properly, usually you're okay.
Okay. So whose idea was it, or did you give them the idea to start dealing in drugs?
No, what happened with the drug trafficking, and again, there's all these legal considerations. There's the issue of entrapment that you have to be aware of. So we, like I said, when we talk about predication for the layman, that means someone is either there's previous information or other evidence to show that they're involved in drug trafficking. So in our case, Luisi was clearly predicated, and it was just a matter of segueing from the other criminal activity into drug trafficking. So what we did on that case is Luisi was always looking for deals on stolen property. And at one point, I told him that I had access to some stolen jewelry, diamonds, but they didn't belong to me, that they belonged to somebody else. And that person who owned them wanted to be paid in cocaine rather than cash. And that's when the drug trafficking conversations were initiated. And as soon as I used the word bricks, which is slang for kilograms, as soon as I used the word bricks, Luisi pointed to the ceiling, which to me meant he believed we might be being recorded. And then he walked out of my office and he motioned me into a stairwell in the building where my office was. And I walked down the stairwell with Luisi. And even though I was wearing a recording device, he whispered in my ear that he basically wanted to do the deal. He wanted to do the cocaine deal, but he was afraid of getting caught. He whispered it so softly that it wasn't picked up on the body recorder. But that day led to additional discussions, which eventually led to me purchasing, I believe I purchased 3 kilograms of cocaine from Luisi and his group, and negotiated for another 4 or 5.
Did you then have to provide them with the diamonds?
No, what I ended up doing, again, just as they manipulate others, our job is also to manipulate them. So we were never going to give them diamonds. It was just a segue into drug trafficking. But what we eventually agreed to do was, I told him by the time he made the decision to sell me the cocaine, I told him that the diamonds had been sold elsewhere and that we still wanted the cocaine. We'd just pay for cash now rather than the diamonds. So I ended up the first 2 kilos. He sent other people with his organization. I ended up negotiating with 3 or 4 of his henchmen, and we eventually bought the first 2 kilograms, I believe, for $50,000 cash.
So I guess the question is, how do you connect this back to Joey Merlino? Because they're both your targets.
Yep. So again, because Luisi was operating under Merlino's authority, Luisi had danced around providing me with cocaine for a little while. I think I asked in late March or early April, and by mid to late April, we still hadn't received any cocaine. So on April 28th of 1999, Prevetti came up from Philadelphia to Boston. Prevetti testified that he had told Merlino he was going to Boston to do a drug deal. And when Prevetti arrived here, we went to my office. So it was myself, Prevetti, and Luisi in the office. And Luisi and Prevetti had a conference call with Joey Merlino in Philadelphia on April. This is all testimonial evidence. April 28th of 1999. And in very cryptic terminology, but very clear to both the FBI and to the LCN, Merlino asked Luisi if he was going to provide the cocaine, and Luisi said that he would. So we had a recorded telephone conversation between Luisi and Privetti, basically blessing the cocaine deal. This was on April 28th, after I had gone weeks without getting the cocaine. And 2 days later, I had 2 kilograms of cocaine delivered to me.
And is that all the evidence you needed? You had that 6-month time frame, that 6-month time constraint.
So when that cocaine was delivered, we had the ability to charge Luisi, Merlino, and others with drug trafficking. The investigation, we wanted to collect additional evidence. So that was in late April. So throughout the month of May, I would negotiate them with Luisi and others for more cocaine. In June, early June, I purchased a 3rd kilogram of cocaine from Luisi and his co-conspirators. That's what we needed in order to effectively charge and prosecute the Boston LCN and Philadelphia LCN on drug trafficking charges. All the personal meetings, phone calls, and the purchase of the cocaine in Boston, we had that all captured on audio and video. So the evidence was overwhelming in Boston. Merlino was behind the scenes in Philadelphia. We had that phone call, and then we had other recordings between Privetti and Merlino. But again, because I couldn't meet directly with Merlino because of the situation I mentioned earlier, I just focused on making a rock-solid case on the Boston defendants.
Well, I would imagine then that Ron Privetti was recording his conversations with Joey Merlino, so you had that evidence too.
Yeah, so everybody was arrested at the end of June in 1999. Merlino in Philadelphia, Luisi and 4 or 5 others up here in Boston. And I want to make it clear that everybody in the Boston case that was indicted was arrested and later convicted. Merlino went on trial in Philadelphia, and he was convicted on other charges. He was not convicted of the drug trafficking charges. He had an effective defense counsel who did a good job of comparing the evidence collected against the Boston defendants versus the Philadelphia defendants. The Boston evidence, like I said, it was on audio and video, and the evidence in Philadelphia just wasn't as strong. So he actually compared the 2 investigations in defense of his client.
So what kind of time did Luisi and the Boston people get?
Luisi, I believe, got 18 years, maybe 20. He had 18 to 20 years. Everybody else in Boston got double-digit sentences, anywhere from 10 to 20 years. Again, when we conduct FBI undercover operations, we try to get double-digit sentences when we prosecute people. We don't, it's up to a jury if they're guilty, obviously, but if and when they're found guilty, we want the sentences to be impactful. And in the Boston case, everybody went to jail for at least 10 years, and most of them for much longer.
Well, I know in the book, what is really interesting is that you continue to work undercover with organized crime, and basically you helped deliver a serious body blow to organized crime in New England. How is that possible? Didn't you have to testify in this initial case?
I did. So this is this is why some people think I maybe have a screw loose. So I worked a Luisi case. It was 6 months. I testified in that trial. I testified both in Boston and in Philadelphia. I testified for a long time in Philadelphia. I testified in 2 to 3 trials up here in Boston. And while I was testifying in those cases, I was preparing for another LCN investigation up here in Boston. It was actually in Rhode Island, and that's something else that's later in the book. But as I prepared to work a new LCN case in Rhode Island, I was called to testify again. Luisi had one of his convictions overturned because of a judicial error, and we had to retry him. And so by that time, I was already involved in the new LCN case, and I spent the one day I spent the morning testifying in federal court in Boston against Luisi. And after I finished testifying, I got in my car and drove to Rhode Island and met with mobsters on the same day. That's not something that's recommended. There's nothing we could do at that time. That's just the way the circumstances worked out. But again, setting up your operations carefully, understanding how you represent yourself, who you meet with. There's always a chance, that you'll be compromised, but you have to remember FBI agents, not only undercover agents, but FBI agents work case after case. So there may come a time where you're working a later case and you inadvertently bump into somebody from another case. Now, if you're a regular FBI agent, that's okay. They know you're an agent. Luckily, I never met somebody in my later LCN cases that I had contact with in an undercover capacity in the earlier cases. So,
yeah, I think the word is luck. I think it is luck. I really do want people to read the book because there's just so many stories and details that just giving an overview of the case, they're not going to get the full story. I mean, I'm thinking about the time, you were asked to go down into the basement with a group of mob figures and you assumed that it was your time, that they were going to kill you once you got down in the basement. I was reading that story with so much suspense, even though I know you're alive today, but it was just so fascinating to read, what was going through your mind when you were thinking that they were on to you and that they were going to kill you.
Right. So that's an interesting story, which people can read in the book. But basically, on that day, I was escorted into a basement area that I had never been in before. This is after they believed I may have been compromised, my identity. And I thought that was going to end as a bad day. And I think you may remember in the book, I mentioned when I got down into the basement, there was a jukebox playing, and it was playing Frank Sinatra's My Way, which was my father's favorite song. And I just got the impression like he was taking care of me 25 years later. I was going to get out of there. And later, we determined the reason they took me in the basement it wasn't because they suspected I was an FBI agent. It was because they were protecting me. They thought the FBI was outside watching us, and we needed more security by going into the basement. So they took an FBI undercover agent and protected him from what they believed to be FBI surveillance outside.
Well, I know one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that you didn't want to become pigeonholed to only doing undercover roles that had to do with organized crime. So we don't need to go into detail, but if you could just tell us some of the other roles that you played.
Yeah, so in the FBI, a lot of times you get pigeonholed into one specific violation. And my first undercover assignments all were organized crime, so I wanted to branch out. So eventually I started doing some drug undercovers. I did some white collar undercovers. I did some public corruption undercovers. I really enjoyed the challenge of doing different violations. Your listeners may be aware the FBI works 250 some odd violations. So there's a lot of opportunity to do other types of undercovers. Organized crime and drugs became my bread and butter, but I would do, especially later in my career, I would do a lot of public corruption, I did some violent crimes. So I had an opportunity to try a lot of different violations. The evidence collection process is the same. A lot of the techniques used, it really doesn't matter what the violation is. But again, the more different types of cases I was able to work, the more tools of the trade I was able to accomplish. And luckily, they benefited me right up until the end of my career.
You say that the tools of the trade, and I thought one of the funny parts of the book was when you talked about your dog control techniques. I love that.
For you dog lovers out there, I'm sure many of you remember the Cesar Millan Dog Whisperer show. My wife and I, we've had and raised golden retrievers all our lives, and we would watch that show in fascination about how Cesar Millan would control dogs. And I actually started, and I joke about it, but it's true. I actually started to apply some of the techniques that he would show that controlled dogs. I would do that in undercover operations. Human beings react very similar to dogs under certain circumstances. There was one case, it was an organized crime / public corruption case where I literally mimicked something I had seen the previous night on Dog Whisperer, and it worked like a charm. So, you chuckle, but dog control techniques also work in FBI undercover operations.
And basically, you just show who's boss, who's the top dog.
You control the situation without them recognizing they're being controlled. And there's a way to do that. I want to be careful. That's some of the trade craft that we work with. I don't want to give the bad guys any advantage here, but they don't realize that you're manipulating and influencing their words and their actions until it's too late. There's certain ways to accomplish that. You'd have to watch the reruns of Dog Whisperer if you want to see that, but it was a very, very effective technique, and I used it right up until my last case.
Well, this has been fascinating. I hope we can spend just a little bit more time talking about something else that was very interesting about your undercover career. Not only because you worked it where you lived, but I'm reading the book and it says that you were also the undercover coordinator in the Boston division. And I'm like, what? So tell us about when you became the coordinator and what the coordinator does.
Yeah, so within the FBI, each field division has what's known as an undercover coordinator, which very simply means they coordinate all undercover activities. When I was in Philadelphia in 1991, I became the assistant undercover coordinator. Back in those days, the undercover coordinator had to be a FBI supervisor. And so in Philadelphia, a supervisor had that position. I was the assistant, and I'd do all the work, happily do all the work. So I was doing that in Philadelphia as far back as 91. I worked with Mike Johnston. I worked with Paul Allen. They would have the job title, but I was able to put together the packages. And what I learned in the FBI was when you want to do well in a certain arena, you have to know the rules and regulations better than anyone. So I started to learn every rule and regulation about undercover operations. I had worked them as a case agent. I had now worked them as an undercover agent. And now I was doing a separate function, which was the undercover coordinator. And basically, the easiest way to describe that is you wear 3 different hats. So when you're an undercover agent, you perform certain duties. When you're an undercover coordinator, you do different things. But by having the cross-section of case agent, and undercover coordinator, I knew the playbook inside and out. So when I left Philadelphia in 1996, early 97, I had done about 6 years in Philadelphia. Well, luckily, no one in Boston had the position when I got here. So once again, I volunteered for the assignment and was assigned as the undercover coordinator here in Boston, which I ended up working for over 20 years here. There wasn't another undercover coordinator for 20 years. And the value of that is because I was a full-time undercover agent, I could also do the parallel job of coordinating the undercover operations while being operational in actual assignments. As the undercover coordinator, you're responsible for making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed in undercover operations. And you're dealing in that world every day. So it wasn't like I was on a bank robbery squad or I was on a white-collar crime squad. I did undercover when I wasn't operational. I was doing it administratively. So really, it was all I did for the last 20-plus years of my career.
Yeah, that's definitely something different. I have to ask you, I hear your dog barking. What's your dog's name?
My dog is Lainey.
Is she a golden?
She's a golden. She's a badly behaved golden. Golden English cream.
I actually had 3 golden retrievers. We've had 3 total. This is totally off subject, but they kept getting cancer and dying of cancer. So the last 2 dogs that we've had have been mutt, yellow lab mutts. But I love golden retrievers.
People always ask me about my relationship with dogs, which is very strong. There were 2 things. When I was working undercover, there's obviously a lot of stress, a lot of pressure when you're doing that. And there's things you need to do to get away from that. And the two things I did a lot of things with sports, coaching my kids, officiating sports. And I spend a lot of time with dogs. Dogs don't talk back to you. They're always happy to see you. So I used the Goldens as kind of a release valve when I was working undercover. And it was very, very effective. I really, there's nothing nicer than an hour's walk in the woods with your dog who's not going to complain or not going to stick a knife in your back.
One of the things that you haven't mentioned is undercover school. So I take it that you did the normal training and assessments that we've heard other undercover agents talk about.
Actually, I didn't, and that's a funny story because when I first started working undercover, there was no training. The undercover training and school and process in the FBI didn't really become formalized until the early 1990s. I was an instructor at some of the first schools, but my training came literally from trial and error on the street. So I was grandfathered into the program. If you were working undercover in the FBI prior to the formalization of the school, there was a process in which, you had to identify what you've done and headquarters made a decision if you were grandfathered. I was grandfathered in. So I never had to go through the training, and I'm not sure how well I would have done because, as I told you before, I was horrible when I first started working undercover. I wasn't very good at it, but I really enjoyed it. I loved it, and I kept working to get better at it. But as far as formalized training, I never had any.
So do you also like jumping out of planes and bungee jumping? And because I heard that it's the same kind of thrill seeking.
You know that we have to go through psychological testing. When you're in an undercover operation, you have to be psychologically assessed every 6 months. And they talk to you about characteristics that are good for undercovers and not good for undercovers. And when they did my evaluations, they used to remark on a couple of different things. Was my stress level was always very low when it came to dealing with subjects, and it would raise when it was dealing with FBI internal issues. So I had more trouble with the FBI internal policies than dealing with bad guys. Tom Suddeth, that I mentioned earlier in the case, Tom Suddeth once said to me in the middle of a case, he said, "You're one chromosome away from the other side." And when you think about that, that can either be a compliment or an insult. So, there is some risk-taking behaviors. You just have to know clearly where the line can't be crossed, and you can go up to and close to the line, but you just can't go across it. So I took our psychological training seriously. I wanted to make sure that, you're always doing things the right way, but you would spend literally, like when I worked the one case in the book, the Rhode Island case, I was undercover for 5 straight years. That's not normal. That's not psychologically healthy for anybody. So you really have to stay on top of your mental status as well as your physical fitness status.
That makes sense. Well, there's a number of things that as I'm reading the book, because I was, in my last 5 years with the FBI, the spokesperson for the Philadelphia division, the media coordinator, I got to learn a lot. Some agents, when they come in, they're working a particular type of violation and they don't know what the other teams are doing. Right. But because I had that role, when there was an arrest or a search or something happening in the office, I got to be in those weekly meetings with the SAC and the ASACs. And so I got to hear what was happening in the office. So I thought I knew a lot. I had a lot of information, but I didn't know anything until I read your book about this national law enforcement undercover team that the FBI initiated. And you were one of the very first agents to be a part of that team. Tell us about this undercover team.
And again, Jerry, you start by saying you didn't know much about it. That was the whole point. That wasn't something we didn't go out of our way to advertise. So what happened there was in 2007, I was approached by the assistant director of the criminal intelligence of the criminal investigative division, CID, down at headquarters. He had previously been my SAC in Boston. And headquarters decided, after everybody else in the world was doing it, people may not understand, in almost every other civilized country, they have national undercover teams. They put their premier undercover agents in the same group and task them with working some very difficult and serious investigations throughout. The FBI never did that before. We would have 56 field officers doing 56 different types of undercover operations. So in 2007, headquarters came up with the concept of having a national team, and I was humbled enough to be asked to lead the operational side of it. I was one of the two original agents. There was FBI headquarters undercover unit supervisor responsible for the admin side, and I was tasked with the operational side. And we were allowed to handpick, based on our experience level, we were allowed to handpick a team of undercover agents and a team of undercover case agents. And then our services were made available throughout the FBI. And between 2007 and 2012, a 5-year period, we supported, I believe it was 23 different field divisions. So we would come in, the division would identify their issue and how they like to approach it using the undercover technique. And we would then set up an undercover operation to address their crime problem. We literally were going all over the country doing this. At the time when we were bouncing around doing this, my kids had already left my home, so just my wife was home. But I was home. I was only home 2 or 3 days out of the month. So we basically lived in hotels. We went around working these cases, and it was a phenomenal concept. And I'd like to think we did a good job with what we were asked to do.
And so you were able to work this while you were still assigned to the Boston office, which is also something that's usually a national team is headquartered, or organized out of FBI headquarters in D.C.
Right. And so what happened in that case, and you having been an FBI agent would recognize that, yes, a national team normally is you're asked to be assigned to FBI headquarters. I was first approached about the job in 2005, 2 years earlier. And at that time, they did ask me to go to headquarters to run this team. And I didn't want to do that. I enjoyed living and working in Boston. So when they came back in 2007, I had 3 conditions when they asked me to accept the assignment. And my first condition was I wanted to stay assigned to the Boston division, and they allowed us to do that. So we were fortunate that we were a national initiative, but we were allowed to remain in our field offices.
You are a good negotiator. So I guess this is something that you did towards the very end of your career.
I did that from 2007 to 2012. I was supposed to retire in 2014, and I stayed until 2017. So
you have to tell us about that, because the FBI has a mandatory retirement of 57. And I know that if you can indicate that due to national security or some important reason, you can get an extension. But you got 3 extensions?
Yeah, so what happened there was mandatory retirement is 57. In 2014, when I would turn 57 and schedule for my mandatory retirement, I was still involved in the Sinaloa cartel case in the trial. So they extended me for 1 additional year in order to go to court and complete that case. And then and again, I don't know the background. You'd have to ask somebody at headquarters, but I was approached as I was coming up after completing my first extension. I was asked to remain for a second extension, which I happily took. I was still allowed. I still worked cases. I was still working undercover, and eventually you have to retire. You're congressionally mandated to retire at 60. You cannot extend beyond 60, but I was fortunate to have 3 separate extensions, so I was able to work 3 years past my mandatory retirement age.
Well, I know one of the last chapters of the book talks about the fact that you wrote the book, in your free time in those last few years of your FBI career.
I wrote the book in preparation for my 2014 retirement, which didn't occur until 2017. So there was 3 years where I just kind of had to sit on it.
Well, I like the fact that you defined why you called it Ghost. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. I'll actually read you the passage if you don't mind. So I've been assigned, as you know, to the Boston Division for more than 20 years after Philadelphia. And in Boston Division, there's an annual award. The proper name of the award is the Kavanaugh Award. It's named after an FBI special agent who died in the line of duty in a helicopter crash in the Boston Division, Paul Kavanaugh. I know Paul's wife and I know his 2 children. One of his sons has since become an FBI agent. So the Kavanaugh Award in Boston is really the most prestigious award a agent can get. And I was humbled enough in 2007 to receive the award. And one of the problems with getting the award is you have to make a speech in front of the entire office at the award ceremony. So I thought long and hard about what I should say. My wife and my daughter attended the award ceremony. My 2 sons one was in the Marines and one was away at college. So in front of our whole office and in front of my family, this is what I said. And I think it's applicable to how I tried to work my FBI career and how I tried to live my life during that time. Very simply, I said, I work in a specialty area within the FBI, which by its very nature is secretive and whose success is recognized by the ability to remain unrecognized as an FBI agent. I'm not comfortable being recognized. I much prefer to remain a ghost, a shadow hiding in the background. That's how we got the name for the book.
And the book again is Ghost, My 30 Years as an FBI Undercover Agent. I'm going to give you the last word. The last episode, I gave you the last word to talk about your FBI career and the things that had happened to you in the Philadelphia office. If you don't mind, I'd love this time for you to talk about the book and the reason behind it, and if you could share with us any stories or reactions that you've gotten to what you've written so far.
Yes, and I appreciate the opportunity. Almost everybody in the FBI who knows me was basically shocked when they heard I wrote a book and publicly discussed my career. And what I've told everybody that's asked is I wrote the book really for one reason initially. I wrote the book for my family. I wrote it to thank my wife for putting up with me and my crazy antics for 30 years. And I also wrote it to my 3 children to provide an explanation as to why I did what I did during their childhood and why I sometimes, or a lot of times, wasn't here for important things. My children are obviously all grown and on their own now, but when they talk about their childhood and some of the things I did and they saw, I thought it was important that they understand what my job was and how I went about doing it. So I wrote it literally for 4 people, and I shared it with them a couple of Christmases ago, and both my wife and my daughter read it in one day. And both my wife and my daughter really had no idea of what I did for 30 years. So it was important to me to explain to them, and especially to thank my wife, because I was running around doing all this crazy stuff while she was home raising our 3 children. And, I just wanted to express my appreciation. When the book started to get some outside attention, there's a whole story about how it became known outside of my family. But when the book started to get some attention, I had a conversation once with one of the publishers, and it was important at that point. You have to remember, the name of the title is My 30 Years as an Undercover Agent. Well, for 30 years, I never opened my mouth. I never discussed what I did. I didn't tell people what I did. You and I worked in the same office, squads away from one another, and you told me you didn't know what I did. So that was the whole point. You're not supposed to talk about undercover assignments when you're doing them. I'm able to talk about them now because they've all been through the court process, through the court system. They've all been adjudicated. And the other reason it's important now for me to describe the life of an undercover agent is because we currently have FBI and all other kinds of law enforcement agents and officers doing the same thing that you never hear of. So there's people out there as we speak doing what I did for all those years, and in a way I can be their voice, or at least I can be someone that recognizes the sacrifices and the great things that they're doing. One of the agents I trained as a brand new undercover is currently involved in one of the most dangerous undercover assignments imaginable, and no one has the slightest idea. And that's the way we like it. That's why I didn't say anything for 30 years. I really thought it was important not to discuss what you're doing because time will tell, but that time's over. I can talk about anything now, and that's what I'm doing through this book. The book came out in early October, and I wrote the book with a co-writer, a dear friend of mine now. His name is Ralph Pizzullo. A couple of weeks ago, Ralph told me he had received an email from a reader who wanted to get a signed copy of the book sent to him. And when Ralph researched it, he realized the person requesting the book was Robert Luisi, or Bobby Luisi, from the earlier LCN case. And Ralph contacted Luisi. And I should point out, Luisi served his time and is now a free man. My understanding, he's involved in a ministry in Tennessee or Oklahoma somewhere. He's converted to a minister. And he was asking if Ralph would sign the book. Well, Ralph contacted him and said he'd be happy to sign the book, and if Luisi wanted me to sign the book. And Luisi said he didn't think that I would be interested in signing the book based on our history together. And as far as I'm concerned, he did his time. I worked my case. He did his thing. I did my thing. He served his debt to society. I was happy to sign his book. So both Ralph and I signed a book to Bobby Luisi and sent it to him. And I was just told this morning that he's received it, and he graciously thanked us for doing it. But when you talk about crazy things happening, here's somebody that went to jail for almost 20 years based on something I did, and he's asking for a signed copy of the book. Again, getting back to why did I write the book? I wrote it for my family, and then I wrote it for other undercovers who sacrifice exactly the same as I did during those 30 years.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Mike McGowan and articles about Bobby Luisi, who is now a Christian minister, and his connection to the Philly mob and Joey Merlino. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all the other popular podcast apps. I don't have a crime fiction recommendation for you. As I mentioned before, I am deep into writing my next book, FBI in Film and Fiction, and unfortunately don't have the time to read for pleasure. I'll tell you more about it in the December Reader Team email. And that's right, I'm supposed to remind you that if you're not a member of the Reader Team yet, you can join by going to my website, jerrywilliams.com, or my Facebook page, Jerry Williams Author, and signing up to join the team there. Or if you're listening to this on a podcast app that supports links, you can sign up right in the description section of this episode. When you sign up to join my reader team, you'll get a copy of the FBI Reality Checklist, and you'll also get access to the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by the agents who have been on this podcast. Of course, Mike McGowan's book, Ghost, is there, in addition to 43 other memoir, crime fiction, and true crime books. And talking about books, I also want to invite you to pick up a copy of my books from my Philadelphia Corruption Squad series, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, available at Amazon.com as paperbacks, ebooks, and Pay to Play is an audiobook. They make great holiday gifts for yourself or for someone you know who loves crime fiction. And I have one more favor to ask you. Many of you have read Greedy Givers and have let me know how much you enjoyed the book. Could you do me a favor? Could you leave a review on Amazon? I would really appreciate it. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for staying around until the very end of this episode. Happy Thanksgiving, and once again, I'm grateful for you. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.